of behavioral science in international law and policy making. I'm Moshe Hirsch, and I'm really privileged to chair this panel composed of 4 real experts in the sphere of behavioral science. So behavioral studies are making inroads into international policy making as well as international law literature. And actually, we could clearly see that in the recent decade, an increasing number of international organizations are turning to behavioral science in order to collect information, or more importantly, to devise innovative programs to attain their objectives. And these objectives include, for example, fighting climate change, international corruption, or poverty. And we have a panel of 4 experts, 1 from the academia and 3 from international institutions. Actually, about international organizations, we have 2 from the World Bank and 1 from the World Health Organization. He would join us very soon. We can see you, Ben. Okay, from the World Health Organization. And before moving to introducing each of the speakers to you, let me say just very few words about myself. So I'm professor of international law at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Significant portions of my publications during the last decade, they focused on cognitive science and international law. Actually, just last week, Anne Van Aken and myself, we published, we co-edited a book published by the OUP, and the title of the book is International Legal Theory and the Cognitive Turn. It is an open source book, and anyone can download it for free. So let me move now to introducing to you each of the speakers. So Anne Van Aken, she would be the first speaker. Anne, she is a chair for law and economics, legal theory, public international law, and European law at the University of Hamburg. Previously, she was professor at the St. Gallen University and senior researcher at 2 Max Planck Institute. Anne was vice president of the European Society of International Law and chaired the EUI Research Council. She taught at the United States, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and she was the general editor of the Journal of International Dispute Settlement, and she's still on the board of editors of some very important international law journals, like the American Journal and the European Journal of International Law. And also, she has been consultant for several international institutions, and her over 100 publications concentrate on international law and behavioral science, psychology, and legal theory. Moving to our second speaker, Renos Vakis. Renos is a lead economist within the Development Impact, where he leads the Mind, Behavior, and Development Unit. The unit integrates behavioral science in the design of anti-poverty policies in a wide range of issues such as financial inclusion, social cohesion, human development, and employment. He has written extensively on issues related to poverty dynamics and mobility, aspirations, mental well-being, and social protection. Renos has also taught economics at the Johns Hopkins University, and he holds PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. The third speaker, Michelle Dugas, she's also here. She also works for the World Bank. She is a behavioral scientist with the World Bank Mind, Behavioral, and Development Unit within Development Impact. Her current work focuses on applying behavioral insights to improve health and environmental outcomes. Prior to joining the bank, she worked as a senior research scientist at the University of Maryland Center for Health Information and Decision System, leveraging behavioral science, technology, and analytics to solve healthcare challenges. She holds a master and PhD in social psychology from the University of Maryland and BA from the University of Ottawa. Last, but certainly not the least, we have Ben McGrady, and Ben is working for the World Health Organization. He is the unit head of the Public Health Law and Policies team in the Department of Health Promotion at the WHO, With more than 15 years experience working as lawyer on health issues, he assists member states to develop and defend laws relating to risk factors for diseases. This includes leading WHO work on international trade and investment disputes concerning tobacco control and supporting other member states when sued for implementing WHO guidance. So, prior to joining the WHO, Ben was based at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at the Georgetown University Law Center, and he has taught at the Georgetown University and Sydney Law School. Okay, so we are set, and Anne, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Moshe, and thank you very much to the American Society of International Law. I am, like Moshe, incredibly happy that we can have this panel here. The reason being, I don't have a, where's the clicker? I don't have a clicker. This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Because we think that there has been really a disconnect of what international organizations have been doing and how international lawyers didn't even know about it. So bringing this together was really our goal, and so I'm incredibly happy to have the practitioners here on that panel to discuss on behavioral and the use of behavioral sciences by international organizations. So what I'm going to do, because I'm an academic and academics are supposed to be critical, I wanted to talk a little bit about the roadmap and some stop signs in using behavioral science. So Moshe already alluded to it. The motivation for this is really, what we can call the behavioral turn of the United Nations, where Antonio Guterres said it's really used to achieve all the goals of the United Nations, SDGs, peace building, fighting corruption, whatever, and also using it within the international organizations to make them more efficient. By now, it's used by about 70 plus UN agencies and other IOs, like, for example, the World Bank, and the World Bank really pioneered it, as you can read in its 2015 report. And it's ever more used also in conjunction with artificial intelligence, which poses even more problems, I think. So only last week, there was a Behavioral Science Week of the United Nations. It's online, so in case you're interested in those matters, join them for the next year. So you get an idea of how and where it is used. Now, as I said, behavioral science and used by the international organizations and international law really has been disconnected. But can this work by the IOs happen in a law-free zone? I give you my spoiler. I think it's a no, a resounding no, and I hope to show you this with my presentation. So the first question is the roadmap. Who uses behavioral science, targeting which actor on what level of governance? And the second question is the stop signs. Where are the limits to using behavioral science, factual and legally? And to be sure, I'm using behavioral science, I'm doing experiments myself, and I do believe in its merits, but I think we need to proceed with caution. So this is what I'm going to do, show you the roadmap, show some stop signs, talk about the factual level of stop signs and the normative level of stop signs. That's a roadmap as I try to develop it, and it's basically trying to answer the question of who uses behavioral science interventions and for whom are they used. And if you look first at the blue side, the international level, we can use international behavioral science not only on how it is used by now by the international organizations. I'm a deep believer, and I've written extensively about it, also on the question of how we can use it on the international level, meaning by states, for example, in negotiations and in treaty design. So here, the targeted actors are, of course, negotiators and diplomatic staff. And for example, the secretariats of international organizations can use it as well when they set up the negotiations. And it's also used internally in the international organizations. So this is really stays on the traditional international law level. Now, on the national level, it's also used, and it is used either by international organizations directly on the ground, so think about UNHCR, and or via national regulatory agencies. So it could be that national regulators use behavioral science informed by international organizations or regulations or guidelines of international organizations, and the WHO, I'm sure, will give us some examples on the tobacco regulation. So trickles down. The ultimate targets of those regulations are citizens or consumers, or also business, especially small and medium-sized enterprises. When we look at the normative levels on how it is used, I mean, what are the legal tools we are using? You can use it in hard law treaties. You can use it in soft law guidelines, for example, the WHO guidelines on plain packaging. You can use it in the UN or in the World Bank, and via designing, implementing and evaluating of policies, guidance, programs, services and interventions that can range from legislation and fiscal measures to communication, social marketing directly on the ground. On the national level, again, you can have formal laws using behavioral science, you can have regulatory guidelines at the national or subnational level, and you can have regulatory practices. And this is what usually the behavioral insights units around the world are using. Now, when we use it in negotiation or treaty design, clearly we can use it in behavioral negotiation theory. Negotiation theory used to be very rational choice-based, or is called red choice-based. This is not the case anymore. But it seems it hasn't really trickled down to, when I at least talk to the German diplomats, trickled down to how we train our negotiators. In treaty design, the first question, of course, is always, do we use soft law or hard law? If we use soft law, and I think behavioral science would tell us soft law is more, has more behavioral force than we used to think when we think in rational choice terms. There is a status quo bias associated with default rules, and soft law oftentimes works as a default. There's a difficulty to discount soft rules as information, and also there are anchoring effects associated with legal standards, and we have some research on that. The use of default options, very, very powerful behavioral tool. They can be used as an opt-out. And what we do know from empirical research, a fantastic paper by Jean Galbraith, which is older, states opt significantly less out of jurisdiction of international courts than if they need to opt in. So it's very similar when you have organ donation numbers. If you have an opt-in, you have 10%, opt-out, you have 90%. It's the same for states. You can really put it on each other. That shouldn't be the case if we assume that states are acting rationally. Even if we discount, the transaction costs of opting out or opting in. And Moshe didn't say this, but in my last life, I was an economist. And of course, the mother milk is rational choice. So you go from here to behavioral economics and then to psychology or social psychology in order to understand how people behave. The default option was used by the WTO and the MC12. The TRIPS COVID waiver is like an enhanced opt-out, which they used. But we can also use it for the reverse of objections to reservations, for example, in human rights treaties, which the ILC unfortunately didn't take up. I think they should have. We can also think about opting out of protocols instead of opting in protocols. That still safeguards sovereignty. So what you see is that behavioral science gives you a range of options in treaty design to enhance international cooperation, and we need it more than ever. Deadlines induce loss aversion. Here again, we have the MC12 Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, which will be null and void, basically, if states don't act within 4 years. Rewarding. We now usually think in sanctioning terms, negative terms in international law, but that hasn't clearly always achieved its goals. Rewards can be found in international law already, especially in multilateral and environmental agreements. And what we do know from behavioral science that it's more conducive to cooperation. Framing and narratives. Choosing the reference points as gains rather than as losses, for example, the goals of the SDGs, and not trade concessions when we talk about sustainability in trade treaties, for example. We also need to think about reframing the game theoretical models we use in IR theory, for example. We mostly think in prisoner's dilemma games, which is not conducive to cooperation, but a lot of those games are actually stag hunts, meaning assurance games, especially in environmental treaties. So I think that also needs to be made clear to the negotiators. And then, of course, Elinor Ostrom, the first female Nobel Prize winner in economics, a political scientist, showed us how very important conditional cooperation is for global public goods and commons. And what we need there are creating and trust-enhancing mechanisms, and transparency and technology will surely be of help. So those are things to go. What are the stop signs? Some factual level. So what we do know, we have a problem of internal and external validity of experiments as well as randomized controlled trials, which are the empirical basis on which behavioral interventions are based. And societies are highly complex systems and they are learning. Unlike in natural science, a stone doesn't always fall. Everywhere on Earth, there are cultural backgrounds, there's context, there are personal differences. So we do need to understand the context and the culture. That also means that we need to use the results of behavioral science cautiously, in particular the experiments. There is a replication crisis, especially in psychology, but also in behavioral economics. Yeah, how many minutes do I have? That's it? Okay.
You can write.
Let me quickly go to the normative, very quickly to the normative stop signs. The UN is using behavioral science and now AI for ever more tailored, targeted, and personalized behavioral interventions. And we are not clear about the legal basis which we are using for those behavioral interventions. So that matters for the legitimacy of using behavioral science and for the accountability and responsibility of the users of behavioral science. Why does that matter? And I just go to this one here, when we use it for consumers and citizens. Nudging is constitutionally relevant. The autonomy and the privacy right of targeted actors may be at stake. There is bias in using AI, and now it's used to scale behavioral science, so that needs to be considered carefully. So I would plead for a detailed risk assessment for privacy, autonomy, and mental integrity of the targets of those behavioral interventions, and principles such as human dignity, informed consent, stringent data security measures, and rights by design must be incorporated. I stop here. I leave out the rest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Renaud.
Good afternoon, everybody. My mother used to tell me that the first 100 years of life are the most difficult. You have 19 years on top of them, since this is the 119th annual conference of this, so I congratulate you. So I'm Renaud Zvakis. I head the behavior science team at the World Bank. And I think Anne made a nice kind of case of some of the uses and the way that behavior science kind of works. I think if you are to get something out of kind of this panel is that the legal system set rules, set processes that we all agree on and try to follow, but the human mind tries but many times fails. And behavior science is just another tool to try to help us get into kind of the behaviors and the decisions and the processes that we all kind of aspire to. So we've been around for about 10 years. We had a couple of years of kind of piloting after this very influential report at the World Bank. But basically, we have been working with my 15,000 colleagues and the 200 governments that the World Bank supports over the last few years to support our grants and lending and operations in the countries, working with the governments to come up with solutions across the full range of issues that they have to face every day. We work across every area from climate and energy to taxation to learning to social cohesion. And over the last few years, we had a lot of interesting results and successes, and a lot of failures and a lot of learning. But just high-level examples and the types of things I was going to say. In taxation, for example, we use a lot of elements of communication and kind of reminders in different ways and different framings that Anne was alluding to increase revenues for governments. In the learning space, we have worked a lot in this area of mental models, and especially these theories of intelligence, which kind of tell us a little bit of how people are motivated or self-motivated, and if they're not, learning can become a constraint. So we have developed interventions to help teachers teach kids to think that the brain is a muscle and everybody has abilities. And if we do that, we found that we could increase learning by 3, 4, 5 months of a school year in terms of test performance. And in health, we have worked in Africa with MTV, for example, to build characters in successful soap operas. For example, Sugar, which is a case where there's a lot of teenagers, so the main character has HIV, plays soccer, but in the process of the story, he has to kind of admit to his friends that he has HIV, and basically a network around him and the friendships kind of try to help him through kind of the experience. But as part of that, lots of storytelling around good sexual practices, going to the doctor, getting tested, etc. And we found through randomized trials and evaluation that we were actually able to double attendance to get STD testing, have fewer partners over the duration of the soap opera, and even following up 2 years later, kind of some of these results were sustained. And kind of a little bit, what exactly we do on a day-to-day basis. And as Anne said, economies think kind of on the left side in deliberative ways, in cost-benefit analysis very objectively. But at the same time, we have these other heuristics that we manage and navigate our decisions every day. We do use a lot of automatic thinking because we want to be efficient. We move a lot with what people around us are doing. And, we have our own beliefs from our experiences. And this is important because then, on one end, as an economist, we are going to use standard policy tools like information, laws, regulation, incentives. But we also can bring the behavior tools into this environment. And basically, the punchline of our team is we should be doing all of it together. So it's not about this or that. It's about doing it all and coming in a system, understanding the setup, the laws, the regulation, the structures, and understanding why are people not able to navigate kind of through these things. So kind of these are kind of the 3 high-level levers of kind of how we think about behavior. So on a given day, kind of in the team, what we do, we have lots of people on a couch in different, symbolic and real ways where we hear their problems. The most beautiful thing that I found in this job is that people don't know what is the problem they're trying to solve. So we spend way more time with a policymaker, with my colleagues, figuring out, okay, I'm trying to solve nutrition, but nutrition is not a behavior, it's an outcome. So spend a lot of time figuring out, you want parents to give better food to their kids, or you want the school feeding program to introduce better cuisine. So we spend a lot kind of couch time, we collect a lot of data, different ways, quantitative, qualitative, and we use that to kind of understand the journeys of the different actors in our universe of policy. It could be policymakers, it could be beneficiaries, it could be the frontline nurse, it could be a truck driver, whatever it is, we try to understand what is it that will help them, what is it that they need to do in their setup, in their structure, to go from point A to the behavior we want them to do that they're not doing, and trying to understand the 50 things that may be happening that may be preventing them. Many of them are structural, many of them may be legal, but many of them are not. Many of them is their beliefs, their aspirations, is kind of a lot of information gaps, a lot of beliefs about what others are expecting of them, etc. So we try to understand this system, And then we're also nerds, and probably the most important element of this is we have to work with evidence. This is not theoretical. So we basically test every single thing that we try to come up with in the context based on feasibility. We do a lot of trial and error, and kind of in a way, this is one of the most kind of really amazing things that has happened. Policymakers these days are very open to experimenting because it's not about testing them whether they're doing their job well. It's about doing something that they're already doing better, and that this is a process that you keep learning. So basically, we are an infinity loop around these things. And so we work with data, we work with understanding behaviors, and we also understand with systems. So I just want to give you one example how everything like this may come together. We're doing a lot of work in labor markets. So specifically over the last few years, a lot of demand to understand female labor force participation. Why are women in many countries are not in the labor market? So we were in Jordan, where we started to understand, well, so in Jordan, if you see the bottom line, the horizontal line, at the time of this work, there were about 15% of the women who could work were actually working. So extremely low labor force participation. So yes, we knew the laws, we knew the system, and a lot of the things that were available, but despite all the laws that allow women to work, still they don't work. So we went and did this survey, this diagnostic, and kind of, if you go, let's start with the left. So we asked people, do you think women should work? And then if you ask this general question, these are kind of people's own beliefs, basically 96%, every Jordanian we ask says it's completely fine for women to work. So, but still, how can you resolve the 96% with the 15 that actually happened? So then we started pushing the question, well, what about working outside of home? Is that okay? And then they told us, well, only 80% said it's okay. What about working if you're married? Well, maybe that's less okay, so 72%. And you can get the point, but if you go on the very right, asking a Jordanian, is it okay for women to work and come back after 5 p.m., only 26% do it. So point one, we understood that belief about work is not a vague thing. It has to be very specific. But this gives us information about how to think, okay, what people believe. The second thing we did, we asked the same people, well, what do you think others think about the exact same questions? And this is the line that comes out of it. And what you see from that line is basically, you see kind of spaces. So this line, it's kind of the fancy word empirical expectation is what you think others are doing, right? So on the left, we all agree that it's okay to work, but we actually think that fewer of us believe that, right? So this is an incorrect information. That's, for a behavioral scientist, that's the most beautiful day. Everybody high-fives each other, because basically it means we all agree on the decision, the behavior we want to do. We just don't know. We don't talk to each other. So that's where you do information campaigns and you share these results. In the middle, it's where the social norms and the beliefs are exactly at the right space. So you say, okay, we have a norm, we all believe that, we can do better. How can we do better? On the right is a place where the beliefs are much more conservative. And because of that, that kind of sucks, because that's a little bit harder to think from an intervention, but I actually think that's where potentially laws and regulations could come in. 2 minutes. And I think kind of there I'm highlighting a little bit how this type of approach can then kind of break a little bit, open up this thought process of, well, what can we do for women in the labor force? And basically each of these buckets tells us a line of many different types of interventions one can do. And this is exactly what we've been doing. So on the left, this is a space where, pluralistic ignorance is this idea that I just said, that we all agree, but we never talk to each other, so we don't realize that. So there is about information. You can do campaigns, you can do soap operas, you can do all sorts of things. In the middle, where the norms meet the personal beliefs, you can potentially, what we've been doing is interventions and policies to support, for example, childcare services, because people agree. So therefore, let's facilitate kind of a structural constraint that women have. Or let's also get the men into the picture. Can we change a little bit attitudes and make men to be cool to be parents. So that also kind of addresses some of that. And on the right side, where kind of the conservative beliefs kind of really are a sticking point, well, maybe that's where regulation, you can start thinking, well, can we create different space and different flexibility, anything from work arrangement? Can we actually legalize different ways for firms to kind of spread the way that distribution of time works, or you know, make it easier for remote versus and home-based kind of work? Maybe there's a security thing. Can we think about ways to promote, you know, buses for women in specific type of industries? And again, I won't go through it, but kind of the point here, just having this additional idea with the team who was full economists thinking about systems and labor markets, etc., we were able to, at least here, I have at least 9 new different ways of thinking about female labor force participation. And then this is, so now I'm going to pass it to Michelle, who is going to blow your mind.
Okay, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Michelle, please.
Thank you. No pressure. Thank you, Renos. So I think, you know, Renos gave a really nice overview of what we do at the World Bank and how we approach problems, and then some of the implications of what we learn about, you know, the drivers of behavior, essentially. So now, also partly inspired by Anne's slides, we're going to talk a little bit about how our approach to solving these problems, tackling them with governments, has evolved as a result, in part, of the rise of digital and AI technologies, which I think, as Anne was suggesting, raises a lot of important questions about how we do the work, but also, you know, raises new opportunities of potentially having larger impact and wider reach for the kinds of interventions that we're interested in implementing. So, you know, a lot of our work now, as we see that the adoption of mobile technologies, even smartphones, is growing across the globe, with now billions of people having access to smartphones, increasingly our interventions are trying to integrate digital technologies to reach a wider audience, and also take advantage of the capabilities of digital technologies, of being, you know, frequent, accessible, nudges that go beyond just a single touch point or interaction that were limitations sometimes of in-person interventions. So just as examples of some of the digital interventions that the team is working on include this interesting kind of deliberative policy platform, so it might be of interest to lawyers, in Cyprus, where the goal was to try and increase trust and social cohesion among the two kind of major ethnic groups, the Turks and the Greek Cypriots, by encouraging them to suggest ideas and ways of improving their government. And then everybody got to vote, get exposed to ideas from the other group, and the results of a test showed that this helped to increase trust between the two groups. So thinking of novel ways of connecting people who might not interact in the real world through the leveraging of these digital technologies, and also kind of tying it through this deliberative policy process. Beyond just kind of website platforms, we're increasingly taking advantage of social media, including Facebook and other social media networks, to both collect data for people who opt in to complete surveys, as well as for communication or behavior change campaigns. So again, these digital technologies and social media networks offer new ways for governments to communicate with their constituents, their beneficiaries, and potentially reach more people with behavior change messages. So this was a huge benefit during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, when everybody had to shift to digital, essentially, because in-person interactions were being quite restricted. Another use case of digital that the team has used has been in trying to reach beneficiaries with more programs and trainings that would be otherwise difficult to implement in person, and also offer new opportunities for measuring skills, do training through initiatives like gamification. So in this example of Skillcraft, the team developed a software solution to have people kind of measure intellectual skills, but also socio-emotional skills in a way that was kind of more entertaining, more interesting to people to complete than just pencil paper. and then also offer this as a certification of skills after doing kind of psychometric validation, and unlock new opportunities to the labor market because people now had some kind of independent certification showing that they have specific skills. So these are all kind of examples that the team has tested in the real world. And I'll also give an example of an intervention that the team designed to address misinformation. So there are many different approaches, right, to addressing misinformation, including the development of regulations or policies or expectations of how platforms should be dealing with the spread of misinformation online. And this became a huge issue, especially in talking with our governments during the COVID-19 pandemic. So while there are, regulatory and policy solutions to misinformation, we find that it's just simply not enough, right? There's an infodemic, there's a proliferation of information that's just too widely available, some of which is good, a lot of information that is bad, the misinformation. So how can we tackle this in kind of a multi-pronged approach? So one approach that has been tested in various settings has been this idea of inoculation. So if we expose people to some bits of misinformation and teach them tricks to identify what's misleading, then they might be able to better recognize misleading information in the real world and be more resistant to it. So the kind of acknowledgement that people will encounter misinformation online places despite best efforts from governments or platforms. So how can we equip people with the digital literacy skills to recognize it and ignore it or resist it, definitely not share it when they do come across it. So we tested an inoculation approach using a gamified chatbot on WhatsApp, recruiting people from Facebook, so kind of the population that you might think could be exposed to misinformation, took them through this kind of training experience on WhatsApp, and compared it with something that is also prevalent in trying to train people, raise awareness about misinformation, which is infographics. And then we compared their ability to detect misleading information and whether they would share misleading information in this kind of gamified environment. And what we found was that overall, those that completed the game performed better, which is great, which is what we wanted. And most importantly, this kind of gamified approach delivered through WhatsApp reduced significantly the likelihood of sharing, so by almost half in this case. And it did a better job than the passive infographics because, one thing that we know from behavioral science and psychology and other fields is that people learn more, they process information better when it's interactive. And they also find, gamification like badges, et cetera, motivating and engaging to keep them kind of in the training session compared to something that's passive like infographics. So all that's encouraging information, just some examples of how we're trying to use the new possibilities of digital technologies to address challenges, some of which are new challenges because of digital technologies, in our work at the World Bank. And I'll also mention that increasingly, as AI tools become more sophisticated and easier to implement at scale for everyday organizations, we are testing whether these are useful tools, one, for upskilling policymakers and practitioners, so our colleagues at the World Bank and others, by introducing things like a chatbot, Socratic chatbot, to teach them about behavioral science principles and how to apply these in their own work. But then also thinking of ways we can leverage these AI technologies to deliver coaching, interventions directly to beneficiaries or consumers in a way that is more personalized so they can kind of get more out of the information that we're sharing from them. So in the same way that the digital technologies, we're trying to be more interactive, more engaging, the AI capabilities that now allow more conversational engagement make that even more feasible. So I'm gonna end there, but one thing that we're testing is these AI-driven gender-sensitive chatbots for career coaching, and there's a lot of opportunities but challenges that come out of this, so happy to talk about that during the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Our fourth speaker, Ben McGrady from the World Health Organization. Ben, please.
Thanks very much, Moshe, and thanks for having me. I'm going to assume that you can hear me and that you can see my slides. So
Yes.
shout out if that's not the case. Thanks. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a lawyer and I work on legal issues, providing legal assistance to our member states around their health laws. I just want to acknowledge Elena Altieri at the beginning of the presentation. She leads our Behavioural Insights unit, which I'll say a few words about in a moment. And I want to give her credit for at least half the presentation. A few key messages or take-home messages right up front. So from the WHO side and in public health, use of behavioural science is not new. In fact, behavioural interventions are common and have been common for a long time. What we will see throughout the presentation is that the way in which we're governing those behavioural interventions and thinking of them has changed. But principally, I'm going to talk about the interaction with law rather than WHO's practice in this respect. But there are a few things it's worth knowing and understanding about WHO to place the presentation in context. First, we're a normative and technical agency. So member states make norms through our organization, through the World Health Assembly and through other bodies. And then we assist those member states to implement interventions and advise them on the how-to of implementation. And so there's a role for behavioural science, both in the normative and the technical functions of WHO. And we'll see that in an example of tobacco plain packaging, which Anne has already foreshadowed. Today, we have a World Health Assembly resolution specific to use of behavioural science. We have a Behavioural Insights unit, which I've mentioned. And I think importantly, we have core principles. And I will come to them at the end of the presentation, but Anne framed the discussion and raised some questions about the use of behavioural science and what are the guardrails, what are the limits on it. And I think in this respect, I'll come to some of the core principles at the end of my presentation, but participatory approaches are core to the WHO approach, and this is consistent with our approach to health promotion over the years. Use of behavioural science in the health context by WHO, it's not about manipulating people to make one choice or another. Rather, it's about creating the conditions for people to make informed and healthy choices. And so participatory approaches, as I'll mention at the end, are one of the key guardrails for us in use of behavioural science. I mentioned that WHO is both a normative and technical agency, and it's important to stress that the organisation includes multiple different parts. We have, on the one hand, the Health Assembly, through which our member states make and adopt new norms. They can be treaties, like the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, conventions, arguably the international health regulations. Anne mentioned not the IHR, but opt-out situations. And under the WHO Constitution, the Health Assembly has the power to make regulations that member states must opt out of and that effectively bind member states, the international health regulations being an example. And then as the WHO Secretariat, we issue guidance using our sort of Secretariat function on how member states can implement the norms that have been adopted through the Health Assembly. This guidance has historically been through development of formal guidelines, and that process is governed by the WHO Handbook to Guideline Development. We use systematic reviews of evidence, including behavioural evidence, using GRADE, which is a methodology for conducting systematic reviews and evaluating the evidence in systematic reviews, that frankly has never been particularly strong when it comes to behavioural science, rather has been originally designed around the gold standard of randomised controlled trials focused on medical interventions. And so we have got to come some way as an organization to move to a truly sort of public health organization with a behavioral science lens rather than a sort of medical focused organization as we evaluate the evidence around different interventions. But outside of these two sort of core pillars of the normative and technical functions of the organization, we have other hosted entities that also have mixed normative and technical functions. Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is one example. A set of WHO member states that are states parties to the convention and that develop guidelines based upon their own experience implementing tobacco control interventions and based upon evidence. The Codex Alimentarius Commission, which has historically developed standards, guidelines, recommendations based upon risk assessment methodologies. And those risk assessment methodologies could also take account of behaviours at the population level, depending on the risk in question that they're working on. Similarly, the International Agency for Research on Cancer undertakes classifications of carcinogenicity of different products, for example, but also does work on cancer prevention, and that includes behavioural aspects. So we have this really complex system within WHO of mixed normative and technical functions. And to give you the tobacco control example, we see that behavioural science can play a role full circle in those functions. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, tobacco plain packaging is an intervention to limit branding on tobacco packs, allowing only a brand and variant name in a standardized font style and size. It was developed essentially in response to tobacco industry behavioral research, where the companies used research to identify the most attractive forms of tobacco packaging. Similar methods, so focus groups, surveys were then used by health researchers to identify the least attractive packaging, in this instance, tobacco plain packaging. Those studies then fed into Framework Convention on Tobacco Control guidelines adopted by the parties to the Framework Convention. They fed also into WHO's technical guidance on how to implement the intervention. And then we see the issue comes full circle when tobacco companies and some countries challenge implementation of tobacco plain packaging, and the international and domestic courts are asked to consider whether the evidence underpinning the intervention is sufficient to justify it, whether the intervention is necessary, whether it's proportionate, rational, reasonable, etc. And then today, of course, countries consider the evidence developed in development of the initial plain packaging measures in individual countries, as well as the prior evidence from focus group testing and surveys, as well as the disputes in developing their own interventions today. Now, that was all before behavioural science was integrated or mainstreamed in any meaningful way into WHO's work. And you can see here on this slide the process that we've undergone. And credit to Elena in this respect. In essence, what she and the Behavioural Insights Unit are working on is building behavioural science into the scientific work of the organisation so that it's present and sufficiently taken into account where it's an appropriate research methodology. And you can see many examples at the bottom of the screen, work on vaccine uptake, on safe behaviours, on healthy eating, which is also an example given by the World Bank. And I think one of the things that's really important to stress about this work is that in the medical public health model, often I think from a legal perspective, I see public health researchers asking very narrow research questions around public health interventions, whereas behavioural science adds a theoretical lens to it and ensures really that we have an appropriate use of mixed research methods when answering questions. And as an organisation like WHO, determining whether or not the answers to those questions are sufficiently generalizable to justify a global recommendation by the organization. So this is my final slide. I just want to mention the 6 principles that have been developed essentially by an external expert group in conjunction with the WHO Secretariat. And these are some of them guardrails for use of behavioral science in WHO's work. So I don't know how easy they are to read from your perspective, so I'll just run through them very quickly. First, cognitive and psychological factors underpin behavior. We acknowledge that as an organization. And that social and cultural contexts matter. They have an impact on that behavior, as do external factors. They can encourage or discourage a behavior. So, for example, the tobacco companies making the packaging more attractive can encourage use. The plain packaging and large graphic health warnings discourage it. Evaluation of interventions is important. Behavioural evidence and theory should be used, as I mentioned earlier. And then finally, as I stressed at the outset of the presentation, participatory approaches they should be used. And in essence, this is consistent with long-standing principles in health promotion, which stress the point that we are trying to create an environment where the healthy choice is the easy choice and where the public are informed about their choices and can make those choices for themselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Okay, so we may take several questions from the audience. Yeah, please. Just present yourself, please.
Thanks. My name is Abhishek. I'm at Georgetown Law. I have 2 questions. My first question is for Ben. Do you have any ongoing efforts in behavioral interventions for alcohol control and sweetened beverages, because they are a big risk factor for NCDs? And my second question is for the whole panel. So do you encounter any frictions between behavioral interventions and international human rights? For example, there might be, like, your interventions might be impinging on freedom of belief in religion. And how do you have any safeguards in practice for that or something like that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, the second speaker, please.
My name is Katerina Linos. I teach at Berkeley Law, and my question is about how we scale interventions from the academic studies to the field. The 2022 Econometrica meta-analysis of 123 RCTs suggested that the effect sizes in the published academic studies are a lot bigger than those when we try to implement. And I'm wondering what some of the challenges are there, what the populations, how do you move from academia to practice?
Okay, the last question, yeah, please.
One more question. We know from...
Could you present yourself?
Oh,
please?
sorry. My name is Graciela Haza. We do know from the literature, like from judges and behavioral science, how that can influence judgment. And I want to ask Anne, we saw you're mentioning treaty design, but how about when we talk about adjudication in the international sphere? And if you have anything to share on that, how maybe treaty design, language, can affect that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's answer these questions in the reverse order. So Ben, you would be the first, okay? Okay.
Sure,
please.
Thanks very much. So with respect to alcohol and sugar-sweetened beverages, yes, we do have recommendations on public health interventions for each. We would recommend that countries comprehensively restrict marketing of alcoholic beverages and that they label them in a way that informs consumers of the risks associated with consumption. For sugar-sweetened beverages, our first recommendation is with respect to taxation, that governments should impose excise taxes to discourage consumption. There are, in fact, legal arguments around these interventions, principally marketing restrictions. We see industry push back and argue that marketing restrictions interfere with their rights of free expression. Typically, these are not upheld by courts. The US is perhaps an exception to this, where the Supreme Court has limited the government's ability to restrict marketing, specifically on tobacco products. And then the second question about effect sizes in academic studies versus the real world. I think, in our practice, what we see is that often we as an organisation are generalising based upon those effect sizes in academic studies. But then when we're working at the country level, assisting governments to design an intervention, we're encouraging them to test that intervention in their domestic context to validate it and adapt it as may be necessary. So, for example, on a packaging and labelling intervention, to do some focus groups or some surveys to examine the question of whether or not the generalizable conclusions from the international literature would apply to them in context. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Michelle, please.
Thank you. So maybe I'll leave the ethics question to you. But maybe on the effect sizes, just echoing what Ben said. As I think in our presentations, we really tried to emphasize as much as possible. We do try and test our solutions in the field, and with this understanding that the generalizability more often than not probably will not be equivalent to whatever is observed in a more, let's say, controlled study. And one principle that is best to follow is to try and test the interventions in a way that would be most, similar to how it would be implemented at scale. So that might be less monitoring than you would see in an academic study, because the implementers will change their behavior if they're being more implemented. So I think in terms of the testing that we do, we try and make it realistic in how a government would be able to scale an intervention. But as Ben was mentioning, ideally we do try and test in the field and validate in different contexts, also taking into consideration what works in one culture might need adaptation in another. But it's, it also takes some buy-in from our partners to do the testing, which can be a challenge.
Thank you. Renaud, please.
This one? Okay. I think, just to follow on this question, we picked the cute name of our team, Embed, because we literally integrate into the ecosystem of our teams from the bank and the counterparts in the policy, and exactly to solve a problem in its system as opposed to kind of an academic exercise. And that has been very eye-opening of an experience, and also the ability to, when things succeed, to scale has actually made it tremendously successful for the things that actually worked, and also to learn quickly about failures and move on and figure out other things that maybe needed to be done in the system. The other thing, we are also trying to build culture around, the research side of things. And one of the initiatives we have that has been internally very successful, and we're trying to scale it, is on reproducibility. So we actually have every single study that is more formal study that we do, it has to go through a reproducibility process internally that we manage in terms of the process. And that has been really, really beneficial, I think, also to kind of help us harmonize and be more systematic about IRBs and this and that. So, and then on the other question, the bank, has a very specific safeguards, whole department that is on top of any operation, making sure, things are happening kind of according to, kind of all the kind of ethical considerations and, no harm, and trying to understand, negative effects that may have happened, by any kind of intervention, not just our work. So we have that kind of as guiding light, but we also in our work, we do register most of the work, that's going to be more academic, to keep us, to keep us, honest and keep us a little bit on top of these things. So I think, we have guidelines and legal entities around the structure. Sorry, Anne.
Thank you very much. Anne, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. There were two I would like to answer. One is the question of adjudicators. We do have studies on national judges, which basically show that they're also succumbing to biases in heuristics. So we do know that judges are not objectively and neutral and not influenced by biases in heuristics. I personally, with others, did a study with international arbitrators and the best of the world. So it was an ICA conference where they allowed us to test about 500 international arbitrators, and we found a similar thing. I tested German judges, and I like to test lay people, law students, or non-law students, law students, and the judges. What you clearly see is that judicial practice sends you to the rational direction. They make much less mistakes. And I think one reason also is where you compare their overconfidence in their abilities. The German judges are much more modest than the international arbitrators or the US-American judges, and they also make less mistakes. So this is something very important. Would I love to test international judges? Yes, but you just don't get them. So, it's difficult to say. We found a similar thing with frontline humanitarian negotiators, again, testing also lay people. The frontliners are hyper-rational, up to a point concerning over-optimism, which amounts to the same level of people being clinically depressed. So they make much less mistakes than classical lay people or students, whom we used to test. Okay, so I think we need to take this into account. Experience, professionalism, practice does mitigate biases at heuristics. That concerns the judges. The second question on I think, which is important, behavioral science and human rights, and this is what I was trying to get at. Religion is one thing, of course. The definition of a nudge is done in a way, and was done in a way by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, that it cannot somehow infringe on your freedom of choice, because it's meant to preserve your freedom of choice. But a lot of nudges, and a nudge is not a nudge, is not a nudge. There are very different kinds of nudges. There are nudges which play on the unconscious. Those are manipulative. We are not preserving choice, and those are the nudges which are constitutionally relevant. And this is where I think the lawyers must wake up and say, stop, check that, right? Religion is the only case where Cass Sunstein would say, this is constitutionally relevant. I would say there are many more cases, and happily, at least European Constitutional Court judges would agree with me on that matter. And we need to understand that on the national level, there has been plenty of literature by lawyers, by philosophers, on the whole issue of using behavioral science, because it has been used for much longer already. But this is not taken into account on the international level yet, and I think this is where we need to go, and this is also where I think, and again, I hope I made this very clear, I'm very much a believer in behavioral science, I think we need it. But the lawyer's task is to say, we make it legally proof, okay? We need the legal proof, and what I'm missing from what I see from the international organization, that this is not a concern. Talking to the UN Secretariat in New York, the concern is not about that. I think there's one publication on the ethical considerations by UNICEF concerning nudges used on children. That is insufficient. Okay? And I'm not talking about the use of neuro rights or something like that. That is, of course, where lawyers absolutely need to come in. But I think they need to come in already on the behavioral level. And this is really where I think we need to work together and to make this rights-proofed. Even more so when AI is used. Because for AI, for everyone, it's clear that we need to make it rights-proofed. for behavioral science if AI is used ever more.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think that we have learned a lot of new things, and please join me in applauding our wonderful panelists, including Ben. Thank you very much, Ben. Just a second. If you signed up to receive SLE credit for this session, your code word is Lemur, L-E-M-U-R. Thank you very much for all of you.